If you'd like, I could tell you this joke. You know, Betts always does that joke. My brother-in-law told me this joke, and I liked it. Are you ready for it? I feel like this is the most spiritual transition I can think of. It kind of reminds me, you know, we're for a couple more weeks, we're part of a movement of churches called the Vineyard Movement. I was born in Southern California in the height of the Jesus people. All these hippies were coming to Christ and then trying to go to church and quickly figuring out that their dirty feet were going to stain the carpets. They weren't welcome. And this guy named John Wimber founded the Vineyard Movement. He was the keyboard player for the Righteous Brothers for a while, who had this experience that I read in Christianity Today a long time ago. This is how they captured, I guess this is how he described his conversion experience in the 70s. Apparently he met the Lord while chain smoking his way through a Quaker-led Bible study. And the Quakers, famously, I don't think they like being called that. They're called the Friends of Jesus Society, technically. They famously, their meetings, you know, they have no pastor. They don't have any teacher guy. They have a board that helps run the operations of the church, and every time they get together, they just sit silently for 20 minutes. And if anything comes to anybody over the course of those 20 minutes that feels worth sharing, that person shares. And if nothing does, then they just call it a Sunday. So silence is sort of central. It's kind of cool. I feel like the whole Vineyard movement that birthed us, the Vine, found its beginning in silence. So here we are, full circle. But John Wimber used to do this thing. He got way into signs and wonders. He was one of these sort of miracle workers types. I remember a pastor friend of mine said, we really need to stop teaching people how to perform miracles because I'm not sure if we're all cut out for it. And anyway, back in the 80s, this was his quote, pastor friend. I don't know what it means, but it's always stuck with me. He said, I mean, back in the 80s, you could wave a dead cat and half the room would fall out in the spirit. Don't know why he said that. Maybe they practiced that. I'm not sure. So he got pretty famous because, like Jesus, their signs and wonders seemed to follow where he went. And that kind of caused people to listen to what he had to say. I'll get your attention. Which I've always had the hunch is that the actual purpose of miracles. Because, you know, even in the Gospels, maybe the greatest recorded miracle would be the resurrection of Lazarus. Remember this? Jesus wept. He ends up praying for Lazarus, his friend, who comes back to life. But, you know, what the story leaves out is then who knows what happened a couple hours or a couple of weeks or a couple of years later. But I'll tell you one thing that happened is that Lazarus died again. It makes me wonder if the point of the miracles is about relieving suffering, but maybe even more deeply than that, it's presenting the mind with paradox, where you're confronted with something that says, does your model of reality have room for this? Have you ever seen something miraculous happen? I remember living for a long time just, you know, like if I could just see one miracle, that would fix everything. I'd finally be the Christian that I'm supposed to be. And a really weird thing happens. I bet you'll relate with this. Maybe tell me if this has been your experience too. You finally do see the miraculous thing, and then you're, whoa, what just happened? And then like a couple hours later, you're like, did that happen? And then like the next day, you're like, I'm not sure. And your mind just actively goes to work scrubbing the memory of the thing that's incongruent with the model of reality that's accepted to be true. And after enough time, it just kind of gets all hazy, almost like a dream. Yeah, this. Anyway, so John Wimber going around the United States and eventually Europe, and people are being healed in these conferences, and droves and droves, like thousands of people are coming out to hear him teach. And he began the regular practice of, as soon as the room got thick with presence, you know, like this, like you could just feel the energy, he'd just do something off the wall to take the air out of it. And there were lots of times when they'd show up to the conference center and there'd be 10,000 people waiting to hear Wimber talk, and he'd turn to one of the guys that was traveling with him and be like, you've heard me do this enough times, you go out and do it, and just disappoint the entire audience. He was determined not to be the man man at the center of the thing. It's like if it's real, you can't chase it away. Even with a cheesy joke like I'm about to share with you. That was all the preamble, just to set up the joke. See, Corey's not here, there's no music, so I could go for hours. All right, here's the joke, ready? A priest, a pastor, and a rabbit walk into a bar. The priest says, I'll have a whiskey, neat. The pastor says, I'll have a light beer. The rabbit says, I think I'm a typo. Yeah, I heard that belly laugh, Jess. You love that kind of, she loves this kind of jokes. Okay, let's keep moving here. All right, this is part 8 of our Exodus series. It's called Let My People Go. And I'm going to read, the bulk of this teaching is going to be me reading the Bible to you, but I made some fun slides to go with it. So, we ready? Well, actually, hold on. Before we go to that next one, let me say it. That's fine, whatever. Just don't read that yet. Just a little setup. The hero of the Exodus story is this guy named Moses. He was born a Hebrew baby and subjugated. The Hebrew people had been subjugated over time. What started out as a healthy and helpful relationship with Egypt quickly became a prison. You know how that happens? The things that keep us safe, we eventually outgrow, and then there's the scary moment of deciding whether we're going to step outside of the familiar or let the things that kept us safe become a tight little prison. Egypt actually means in Hebrew constriction. So Moses is born in constriction during a period of time where the Pharaoh had ordered for the execution of all the Hebrew boys. He was scared of the growing population. And through a series of miracles, Moses was rescued. He ends up growing up in the Egyptian courts as almost a son to Pharaoh. One day he sees an Egyptian taskmaster striking one of his own people, and he's filled with this righteous indignation. But then he does something kind of sneaky. The text is important. It says he looked this way and that to make sure that nobody was looking. And then he killed the Egyptian taskmaster, buried him in the sand, and hoped he got away with it. The next day, he tried to break up a fight between 2 Hebrew people, and they said, you going to kill us too, like you did the Egyptian? And Moses is like, oh, they're on to me. And so he goes on the lam for 40 years in a neighboring town called Midian. Midian in Hebrew means to contend with oneself. And after 40 years of being nobody in the middle of nowhere, he encounters this bush that's burning. It doesn't burn up, and out of the bush comes the voice of God who says, Moses, I know you. It's time for you to return to Egypt and say to the Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses is he's been humbled to the point of being open, but perhaps he's been stuck in self-analysis for long enough that he's stalled out. That can happen. You know, there's a reason why what do you know about self-deception? You ever notice how easily you can deceive yourself? You ever have a friend who's honest enough with you to tell you, like, you know, why do you keep doing that? And you're saying, well, that's not the reason I'm doing that. And then you can't get the thing out of your head, and you finally decide to listen to it, and then you realize that's exactly the reason that you're doing it. You just had no idea. Or you believe something so very strongly because it feels central to who you are, that anytime, here's a little story. I had a pretty sheltered upbringing, and I had these darn liberal family members, okay, up in the Northeast. We weren't into our flavor of Christianity, and one time, it's just a young buck, it's probably 8 or 9 years old, and I think I'd already won some awards for scripture memorization in the local chapter of the Christian Boy Scouts that I was in. And I had a pretty stable worldview, which is nice to have. But these relatives came into town. And my cousin, who's about the same age as me, came swimming over to me in the pool. I think I was hanging onto the diving board floating there. And she said, Bobby, you know that the Bible is just a book of lies invented by white people to control the masses, don't you? And I was like, oh my God, how dare you? And something in my psyche went like, and so I did the only rational thing, which was, try to make an enemy out of her. And then I got older, and I don't think white people wrote it, but the rest of the analysis is, is how it's been used. Yeah, self-deception, stuck in these ideas. So I think Moses gets out from under the burden of that, but what the trade-off is that he's become just terribly insecure. So God's like, go and do this. And Moses is like, no way. It's actually really funny how he says it. At one point, he's like, God's given him, he's like, I'll be with you always, and I'll put the words in your mouth. And Moses is like, I've never been very eloquent, neither earlier nor since you started talking to me. I'm still not eloquent. And so I think, you sure I'm the guy for the job? And God is like, who is it who made the mouth and formed the words? And gives one of these like Old Testament kind of like, God, like, get off me, sort of. And Moses interrupts it and goes, pardon me, my Lord, send someone else. Okay. Eventually, God's like, all right, fine, you need a partner. So you get Aaron. Now, go. All right, that's the setup. You ready? So Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and he said to him, let me return to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive, which is not at all what he's going back to do, but I don't know if he thought that would get him out of there quicker. It worked. Jethro said, yeah, sure, go. I wish you well. Now, the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead. So Moses took his wife and sons, he put them on a donkey, and he started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I've given you the power to do. But I'm going to harden his heart so that he'll not let the people go. That's a paradox. Make sure you do this to set the people free. However, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go because God hardened your heart. This is confusing. So I will kill your firstborn son. Oh, gosh. Some Old Testament stuff there. The next slide. Let me just tell you what's happening here, okay? This is what the text says. So Moses is going. This is the next verse. And then it says, then the Lord's rage burned against Moses, and he encountered him on the road to kill him. And just before he was to strike Moses down, Moses' wife, Zipporah, circumcised Moses' sons and splashed the blood on Moses' feet. At this, God was pleased and let them go. I spent a solid 10 hours trying to find a sermon in that, and all I can tell you is this book was written a really long time ago. You can take your crack at that if you want. She says, now, Zipporah says, now I am a bridegroom of blood. Should be a great name for a metal band, if anyone is. Moving on. The Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness and meet Moses. He needs your help. So Aaron met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything that the Lord had sent him to say, and also about all the signs that he'd been commanded to perform. Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. When they'd heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness. And the Pharaoh responded, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I don't know this Lord, and also I will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now, let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword. This is also, seems to me to be slightly stretching the truth because he wasn't instructed to take a 3-day. If I heard somebody say, I'm going to take a little 3-day journey, I'd be like, yeah, you could probably use a vacation, but that wasn't the plan. They were trying to get out of there. So king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to work. And Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you're stopping them from working. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and the overseers in charge of the people. He said, you are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They're lazy. This is why they're crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies. Then the slave drivers and the overseers went out and said to the people, this is what the Pharaoh says, I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had straw. Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers that they had appointed, demanding, why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? This is a bad scene. And this is the last section. Then the Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh, saying, why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we're told, make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Pharaoh said, lazy. That's what you are, lazy. That's why you keep saying, he's pretty committed to this train of thought. That's why you keep saying, let's go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You'll not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks. The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told, we're not going to reduce the number of bricks required. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, anxiously awaiting the ruling. And they said, may the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to the Pharaoh and his officials, and you've put a sword in their hand to kill us. Moses returned to the Lord and said, why, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this what you sent me for? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. That's Exodus 4:18 to 5:23. We'll pause there, and I'll just ask you, rhetorically, what do you notice? What do you make of this story so far? What stands out to you? Yeah, it's brutal. Yeah, sometimes things get worse before they get better. Yeah, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart seems to look like Pharaoh knows exactly what the problem is, and he also knows how to fix it. Do you have that guy inside of you? C.S. Lewis has this great line where he's like, look, God is just too generous to keep from giving you exactly what it is that you think you want for too long. So if you think you want power and control, you may not find it for a while, but eventually God in his grace will give it to you. And it looks an awful lot like what Pharaoh's doing here when he does, Rilke has this line, he says, go to the limits of your longing. And all these famous people in recent years have been so generously reporting back to us. I think it's Jim Carrey is like, I wish that that guy's pretty far out. Have you seen some of these interviews where he's like, Jim Carrey has been a great character to play, and I'm really grateful to have had the role. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but I think I'm done. He said that to Jimmy Kimmel one time, and he didn't even know how to respond. He was like, you got anything funny to say? Jim Carrey said something like, I wish everybody had an opportunity to become rich and famous and successful beyond their wildest dreams so that they could learn that the answer isn't there. It's not there either. But suppressing the desire to experience it creates its own other host of problems. So maybe God generously hardens our heart, lets us go down a path that may not be the best for us because we got to know what it feels like. Otherwise, it's never going to go away. Yeah. Yeah, Al's describing that deeply human impulse to overlay reality with our set of expectations for what reality ought to be, and then to go about living our lives in a place of profound discontent because reality won't cooperate. Or alternatively, life becomes nothing more than a series of self-fulfilling prophecies because we've already decided what this relationship is like. And we already know what it's going to, what it's going to feel like when we get there. Or, oh, here comes this person. I know what they're going to say. Yeah. Life begins at the suspension of judgment. Real life. Yeah, it's the foundation of, liberation. When I read this, here in the last couple of weeks, I was reminded of the interior soap opera, as this guy Martin Laird calls it. If you're looking for a book to read, may I recommend to you, there's this old man named Martin Laird, who's a professor of early Christian studies at Villanova, I believe. And he's written like he's like 80, and he's written like 4 books, and 3 of those books are like 100 pages. And that to me is a really good sign. And he's got this little series on contemplation. The first one's called Into the Silent Land. And the second is called A Sunlit Absence. And the third is called An Ocean of Light. And I got all 3 just based on those titles. And they're beautiful. And he writes with a lot of depth and clarity. And so he talks about the interior soap opera. Let me read you the full quote from him. He says, union with God, oneness. It's not something that we acquire by a technique, because it's the grounding truth of our lives. And it engenders the very search for God, which is so good. St. Francis said, what you're searching for is where you are searching from. Because God is the ground of our being, the relationship between creature and creator is such that, by sheer grace, separation is not possible. God does not know how to be absent. The fact that most of us experience throughout most of our lives a sense of absence or distance from God is the great illusion that we're caught up in. It's the human condition. This illusion of separation is generated by the mind and is sustained by the riveting of our attention to the interior soap opera, the constant chatter, the cocktail party going on in our heads. So when I was reading through this the last couple of weeks, allegorically, as I like to do, I couldn't help but think of Freud and then Jung's model of the psyche, because it contains the 3 primary actors in the interior soap opera. We'll just go over these real quick. So that's well, you can figure out who those characters are, right? Aaron is going to be the stand-in for the superego. It's a little bit of a stretch, all right? I stretch the metaphor a little bit, but thank you. Okay, so you got the id over here as Pharaoh. It's this primitive, instinctive part of the psyche, and the id just wants what it wants: power, control, survival, gratification immediately, regardless of cost. Its biggest fears are change, uncertainty, and it resists violently anything that threatens its dominance in here and out there. This is id. It's impulsive. Have you ever picked up a prayer practice or a new hobby only to discover a resistance in you that's like Pharaoh in the story that says, we don't have time for this? There are too many important things to build. We can't stop now. Keep working. Do you know this one? What happens when you sit silently? What's the first 5 minutes or so like for you? Oh, that's nice. Regulating. What's that mean to you? I used to fancy telling people about 10 years ago when I first attempted to develop a meditation practice that I quickly discovered my backyard is like my brain is like a yard full of cats. That's what it felt like to me. They're just crawling all over the place. That looks like trying to herd cats, and I tried to get my little kittens in line in my mind, and they would crawl at my staff and into my hair. 45 minutes would go by, and I would be like, I just thought about everything. I thought about things I didn't even know I could think, and I don't think any of them were consequential. What a tremendous waste of time. Get back to work. This thing kicks in. Anyway, you're hungry. You can't meditate when you're hungry. Get up there and maybe after a taco. That didn't work. I probably need a book. One time I was listening to this podcast on silence. This can't be right. Fortunately, Jess made a book ban. She's like, there's enough books about silence. No more. You're cut off. Thanks. When it's out of balance, the id spirals, demanding gratification now regardless of cost. It's how you get to where we are as a society. It's the shadow side of living in the moment. There's no consideration of the consequences of what we feel like we want. And 90% of the time, at least in my case, I have no idea what I want till I sit still long enough to let the dust settle, to see what's actually in here. The superego, meanwhile, is the moral compass. It's the voice of higher truth, conscience, spiritual ideals. And it reminds the ego of what's right and what we're called to become. Superego speaks with clarity. Often in the voice of the sort of internalized values from childhood. Whatever we grew up thinking is the right way to live, being taught is the right way to live. This is the voice of the superego, who knows who he ought to be and knows that there's no time to waste. The superego is also called the inner tyrant or the inner critic because it can become relentless in its demands that, the id get itself under control. So we can get back to the important virtue signaling work of being a good boy or a good girl or finally learning how to pray or finally finding and completing our calling. Superego is relentless in its aims for self-mastery. And it's a kind of self-mastery that for most of us is completely impossible. And when out of balance, the superego becomes a harsh critic rather than a guide. And we collapse into toxic shame. You familiar with that, fella or lady? And I've had friends over the years that have found it helpful to name that voice so they can get a little separation from it. I remember Nanette, the old bookkeeper here, she called that voice in her, when she became familiar with it, Judge Judy, and she would just ask it to quiet down, Another friend of mine calls his Brian. I've never asked him why. Doesn't really matter what you call it. It's just nice to get a little separation from it and realize that it isn't you. It sounds just like you. And when it really gets going, it feels like it's all there is to you. And it's not. It's just a piece. It's a part of the whole. All right. So we could call this next little bit sympathy for the ego. Because stuck between the relentless demands of the id and the impossible ideals of the superego is the ego itself, our conscious self, our deepest feeling of who it is that I am, our personality, our often deepest. And the ego is trying its best to navigate reality, but it's often overwhelmed or conflicted or unsure. It wants to do the right thing, but it's afraid of failure and opposition. And also, it's just exhausted. That's a lot to mediate between. Those are diametrically opposed impulses that are consistently happening within the same body. And stuck between them is the ego, doing its best to mediate. Have you ever been in a situation like this here in the outside world? You got some sort of rupture in your family or friends, and you just want to stand in the middle of it and help, only to find out relatively quickly that maybe neither party wants to be helped, even if they say they do. They can't budge an inch from the position. If you stay in that fire for too long, it's being a mediator. It's exhausting. The whole thing feels like So we see Moses. I feel like Moses is in this position because he's like, I want to obey this higher call, but he's just racked with insecurities. Not sure if he's up for the job. And then things go from bad to worse. It's like, look, I tried. I tried to do the darn thing he asked me to do, and the other part of me didn't want me to do it, and I didn't let it run the show, and I pushed through, and I did the right thing, and I went, and I was scared, and I did it anyway, and now everything's twice as bad as it was before. And what is happening? This thing? Like, the ego is like, if it can't be the hero, it's totally content being the victim. Why is this happening? Did you hear what happened to me? Can you... So this section's called Sympathy for the Ego because it's such a cultural trend at the moment to sort of like shame the ego. You gotta like wake up in the morning and kill your ego or transcend it completely. And I have a theory about this. I think this impulse is a result of the sort of collective conscious of Western society attempting to assimilate and master the wisdom of the East, the Church of the East and the Church of the West, and this is just in Christianity, went through a 1,000+ year split where the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic and Protestant Church here in the West had no communication, little to no communication with each other, and just built up walls and walls of assumptions and resentment. And round about the time that somebody came up with the airplane, and we could go and visit other cultures that, we'd been taught to be afraid of, and have exposure to all these different expressions of humanity, it's really difficult to keep judging and criticizing when we're in the presence of the other person. You ever had that thing where it's like, you ever walk into a room and everybody gets real quiet and you think, were you just talking about me? Or you're on the other side of that, you're like, I don't know if you heard about what Susan was up to. And then Susan walks in and, oh, hey, Susie, what's up? We're just hanging out in here. Like when somebody walks into the room, it changes the conversation about that somebody. And it's really hard to go on being afraid and having hatred for folks who aren't like us when we become immersed in their culture and being and life, and you realize, oh gosh, we're not really that different, are we? The world kind of collapsed in on itself in the last 100 or so years, and I feel like if we survive the moment, if there is somebody who keeps recording history, in 500 years they're going to look back on us who are alive right now and be like, those poor people. Oh my gosh, look at how much they're made to assimilate, because there's the airplane and then there's the internet. Like my grandma lived to be 90 years old. She grew up in a little farm country in Indiana. And she remembers the first time power came to her city. Like the mayor of the town called them all out and flipped the breaker for the first time and streetlights came on and wow. And then like before she died, she had like a Facebook page and she was like, did you see what cousin, Julia's up to? Like that much change in one lifetime. Like it's too much to assimilate. And I think with our like materialistic, accomplishment, achieving, driven society, We're introduced to the wisdom of the East, but without just direct experience of being brought up in the culture that's very different from our own. I heard this lecture by Alan Watts where he warned a Western audience about taking on the practices of the East without any knowledge of the cultures and philosophies that undergird the practices. And he likened it to the experience of becoming very sick while out of town visiting a friend. If you happen to become ill while staying at a friend's house, he said, it is not a wise course of action to go rifling through their medicine cabinet, taking whatever medications you happen to find there in hopes that it will cure what ails you. I remember seeing this hip psychedelic bumper sticker not that long ago that said, the ego is not your amigo. And I was like, yeah, I got to get me one of those bumper stickers. Just tell my ego what's what. And while the ego certainly has its problematic features, such as convincing us that it's the totality of the self rather than just a part of a larger whole, at the end of the day, it's really just doing its best with an impossible task. And when out of balance, the ego freezes or collapses, no longer able to play the mediator between two diametrically opposed forces. Yeah, so those are some of the actors. And do you guys know, do you tune into this show? Yeah, or is it just like playing in the background, you know? Streaming live in your brain right now. I remember going through a particularly challenging period, and I finally was just like, my little ego was like, I'm toast, check please. And I went online and saw that Hannah Park had some openings, and Site 82 was available, and I was born in 1982, and I thought, well, it's probably as good a place as any to get born again. And so just dropped out of society for a week and went wandering around the forest. And over that course of time, I became very aware of all these different me's in here, Like I remember the first one I met, I was walking through the woods and like a butterfly landed on a flower or something. And I noticed it. And then immediately, this little teacher guy that I have in here kicked into gear, and he's like, that is so beautiful. The butterfly represents metamorphosis, and the flower is and it just like ruined it. It totally killed the moment. Started mansplaining to me just how beautiful this thing was. And I was like, I was so much happier when this didn't have to mean anything. So I just give it a break, man. Just relax. Look, it's a butterfly. It's pretty. And then the little, anyway, I could tell you about me, but why don't you take a minute to reflect on that and just see if you notice anything about yourself in there. So if you engage with this practice that I like to call spying on myself, you quickly can become overwhelmed, You realize like, there's a reason that my interior life is arranged in such a way that I've been afraid to be honest with myself about what's really going on in here. Afraid to the point of completely avoiding it. And maybe there's a reason why that aspect of who we are has built this society that drives us all crazy, where you're driving down the highway and it's just billboard, 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 billboard. Everything you do is like, buy me, go here, do this, keep moving, go. Wow, one more thing is going to be great. The best burger in town. Read 48 Marquise down 3rd Street, like it's just everything is like, go, do, move, quick, stop, don't think, don't look at that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Because when you start making time for it and you get in there, I don't know, what do you do? My thing goes, we have to fix this. I remember a couple weeks ago somebody saying, those old like marriage seminars that are like men are like spaghetti and women are like waffles or something, and okay, yeah, some of the genders are various food items and they've got these patterns, and the waffle woman is like, my day was hard, and the spaghetti man was like, I can fix it, and she's like, stop trying to fix me, and he's like, well, why did you bring it up? And then they're gonna get into a fight, and then that thing. So a few weeks ago, I just remember somebody saying, when she encounters this inside, it's like she has an instinct to like mother herself, that these are parts that just need to be reparented, that maybe it would be helpful to be a wife to ourselves instead of a husband sometimes. And just see that this is all happening and that we don't really know what to do with it, and that's all right. This kind of like self-observation is what gives us freedom from the patterns. And enough time in observation without judging it. That's the trick. Is you notice the inner critic and then some other inner critic was like, yeah, that guy stinks. I don't know how many of them there are. There's that old theological joke. One of the church fathers said, we got to figure out how many angels are able to dance on the head of a pin, and then we'll have this whole God thing cracked. It's just not really answers, and that's kind of the point. The point is to be overwhelmed to a point of collapse so that we finally become open enough to the grace that's always been here. And it's a grace that it's offensive in some way to us, even as it's healing us, because we're not doing anything. And we can't do anything. And that's the message of Christianity that's gotten so lost in translation that I can't even understand how we're collectively here where we are. It's like St. Paul said, hey, those who are governed by the Spirit have no need for a law. You don't need any of it. You don't need the scriptures. You don't need teachers. You don't need churches. You don't need any of it. And then the early church fathers, being young fathers, I've been a young dad before. I had no idea what I was doing. They had no idea what to do with that, because you can't really build a structure or a system on top of the gospel, which is that you're already okay. You don't need me or anybody else. You're it. And so this whole no use for a law thing didn't make any sense. And, anyway, all these people are getting baptized, and they want to know what they're being baptized into. And so here comes the idea. John's gospel explains it most eloquently, and it just says, like, essentially, all our righteousness is like filthy rags. It doesn't matter what you do. And the newly converted ego goes, oh my God, okay, I'm free from having to do, but I have to do something. And then we read the scriptures. That's, what I believe is what matters. I got to believe right. And so belief becomes the new pursuit, the way that we're going to finally fix ourselves or heal the world. Is we just got to get everybody to believe the same thing. Which blinds us to the fact that there are as many religions as there are people, and if we just would learn to listen to each other, we would all recognize the same thing. And churches spend all this time just trying to get people through this machine so that we all start thinking the same way, but all that does is teach people there are some things that it's okay to say out loud, and a whole bunch of other stuff I better keep to myself. And then we go, okay, good. We got them through 101, 201, 301, got our thinking straightened out, And I don't know about you, but like I can get my behaviors under control. I'm not really good at that, but I got a better shot at getting my behaviors under control than my beliefs. My beliefs seem to be given to me, and they have a mind of their own, and they change when they want to. And if ever I try to change one or cling to another, I cease to exist. It isn't true. It isn't. There's, you know the word make-believe? Yeah, so it's a gift when we come to the end of our ability to fix or understand reality or even ourselves, because, like I said, that's the cracking of the shell. It's how the light gets in. So what to do about this soap opera? Well, it's good to be aware of it, because otherwise it silently runs our lives as we think that we're making novel choices, and it's just a bunch of patterns playing itself out. But it's also good not to become so fascinated with it that we're no longer present to the moment. So we don't need more information, and we don't need to finally conquer our inner life, and we also don't need to just abandon the whole thing. What we need is some time out of mind. You know those like float tank things? You know, I've read this stuff about like, I had a friend that worked at a float tank, and he's like, you want a session? I'll give you 3 hours for free. And I was like, oh, I'm going to transcend space and time if I do that. And so I was like, most definitely. And he's like, come see me on Tuesday. Well, on like Saturday, I was doing a project in the yard, and I got this deep gash in the back of my knee. And it was pretty nasty, and it was in the back of my knee, so it was hard for it to heal. And then I went on Tuesday to my float tank. I lowered myself into that salt concentrated water, and all I felt was fire for 3 hours. It was just on my leg. And I did not transcend space nor time. So, to try that again sometime. Anyway, those things I've read, like how, like, you know, our body like desperately wants to heal itself, and like one of the benefits of those is that it takes all the pressure off the joints, and then magically, miraculously, we're healed. Contemplative practice is the same concept. Just spend some time out of the patterns, and then you don't have to fix anything. Like this thing wants to fix itself. We want to be whole. It's very difficult to get there with all the pressure that we put on ourselves, all these different patterns. So here's the prescription. This is Wendell Berry. It's called The Peace of Wild Things, and we'll close with this. He writes, when despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with the forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I'm free. So we've got, it's 11:23. So we've got, 7 minutes. And you're free to use this 7 minutes however you'd like. That's it for the words for now. But I'll just say that I trust you enough to know that you know what to do at this time. The Eucharist is available. The elements are here. If you'd like to take and eat, you're more than welcome. I do believe we've been approached by a guitar player. If you want to, Corey's not here, and somebody noticed and said, I can play guitar. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, if you can find a guitar, or I don't know, any of the rest of you play anything? You guys want to do something? All right. We got 7 minutes. Yeah. Use it as you see fit, and I'll let us know when it's 11:30. You're also welcome to leave now if you'd like. You don't have to feel trapped in here.